I stood frozen in horror, watching helplessly as my beloved home shattered into pieces and tumbled into the muddy waters below, destroyed by the relentless roar of a bulldozer. Behind it all was Victoria Caldwell, the ruthless HOA president of Brookside Hills, who had no idea my brother had just been sworn in as Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court less than 24 hours ago. But just as I thought the nightmare couldn't get worse, Victoria returned one final time, eyes burning with fury, a gas can in one hand and a matchbox in the other. Would her desperate vengeance destroy everything my community had fought so hard to rebuild from the ashes? I can still recall the precise moment my peaceful life at Brookside Hills began unraveling. It was a quiet morning, and I was sipping coffee on the porch of my creekside cottage when a harsh mechanical growl shook me from my thoughts. "Not again," I muttered under my breath. Outside stood Victoria Caldwell, clipboard in hand, her dark hair perfectly styled, untouched by the morning breeze. "Mr. Bennett," she called with her usual artificial smile that never quite reached her eyes. "We need to discuss your ongoing violations." I stepped onto the porch, the familiar wooden boards creaking beneath my feet. My late wife, Emily, had chosen this cottage specifically for that comforting sound. "What's the issue this time, Victoria?" She pointed her manicured nail toward my mailbox. "That shade of blue is not HOA approved. Page 12, Section 3 of our Community Handbook clearly states mailboxes must be painted forest green or matte black." This was the fourth complaint this week. Yesterday, it was the decorative wooden statues in my garden being deemed an eyesore. The day before, my bird feeder was cited for attracting unwanted wildlife. "I've had that mailbox for over 10 years, I replied calmly, "long before you took over as HOA president." Victoria narrowed her eyes slightly. "Grandfather clauses don't apply if the board unanimously votes to update the standards, which we did at last month's meeting." Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, cautiously watching the confrontation. Nobody had dared challenge Victoria since she forced the Hayes family to sell their home after their son's wheelchair ramp violated aesthetic guidelines. "I'll repaint it," I said, trying to keep peace. "You have 72 hours before fines begin, $250 a day," she responded, glancing behind me toward Emily's cherished rose garden. "And those non-native plants will need to be addressed too." My pulse quickened. "Those roses aren't going anywhere. My wife planted them before she died." Victoria's expression didn't waver. "Sentimentality doesn't override regulations, Mr. Bennett. The board meets tonight to discuss further actions." As she walked away, my phone buzzed. My brother Michael was calling, probably to remind me of his swearing-in ceremony tomorrow. I couldn't burden him with my HOA headaches right now. "Hey, Michael, what's up?" I tried to sound casual, even as Victoria circled my property, snapping photos. "Just wanted to confirm you're coming tomorrow," Michael said cheerfully. "Big day for me." "Wouldn't miss it," I assured him, watching Victoria carefully document each violation around my yard. "You sound stressed, Daniel. Everything okay?" "Just neighborhood stuff. Nothing serious," I replied, wishing desperately I'd known how wrong I was about to be. That afternoon, I found an official HOA notice stuffed aggressively into my mailbox. Victoria's message was clear. Emily's rose garden had to be removed immediately, citing water conservation guidelines. If I didn't comply within 36 hours, the HOA would perform an emergency landscaping intervention. Feeling cornered, I turned to Samuel Foster, a retired attorney living just 2 doors down, who'd always treated me kindly after Emily's passing. Sitting on his screened porch, Samuel shook his head, flipping through the notice. "Legally, they can't enforce this. Those roses were planted long before the water restrictions. Plus, you've already installed that rainwater collection system." I sighed heavily. You know, Victoria doesn't care about legality. She just wants total conformity. Samuel leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. There's something deeper going on, Daniel. He unfolded several documents across the table. Have you seen the blueprints for Brookside Hills Phase 3? My stomach tightened as he traced the map with his finger, stopping directly on the spot occupied by my cottage. Summit Property Group plans luxury condos right here, exactly where your home is sitting. And here's the kicker. Victoria's husband, Thomas Caldwell, is on Summit's executive team. So these violations are nothing but pressure to force me out? I asked, anger rising in my chest. Exactly, Samuel confirmed grimly. Watch your back, Daniel. People like Victoria Caldwell rarely give up easily. That night, I meticulously photographed every inch of my property. Emily's roses, the mailbox, even the garden statues. I had a sinking feeling I'd need proof very soon. The next morning, as I prepared for Michael's ceremony, Victoria appeared again, flanked by 3 HOA board members and a bulldozer operator. Routine community improvements, she said coolly when I questioned the heavy machinery idling nearby. Nothing directly concerning your property. Yet, as I drove away, glancing nervously in my rearview mirror, I saw Victoria barking orders into her phone, and the bulldozer inching suspiciously closer to my land. I nearly turned around, but Michael had stood by me through Emily's illness and death. I couldn't miss this moment for him. If only I'd realized that by leaving, I was handing Victoria the perfect chance to destroy everything I'd built. My heart stopped as I rounded the final corner onto my street that evening. Flashing police lights pierced through the twilight, neighbors huddled together, whispering anxiously. The creekside cottage, the home Emily and I had cherished, was gone, reduced to splinters and rubble cascading into the creek below. I slammed my brakes and stumbled out of my car, desperately searching for answers. What happened? Where's my house? My voice trembled, barely audible over the pounding in my chest. Victoria Caldwell stood calmly beside the HOA board members, holding a stack of papers. Mr. Bennett, we tried contacting you several times today. What have you done? My voice didn't sound like mine anymore. Your home was deemed structurally unsafe during our inspection earlier, she said coldly, handing me a document. The board authorized immediate demolition, for the community's safety, of course. My vision blurred as I tried to comprehend her words. Impossible. My house was completely sound. Officer Hernandez approached, eyes downcast and clearly uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett. They presented official permits. Falsified permits, Samuel Foster interjected, hobbling through the crowd with his cane. I just got off the phone with county officials. No demolition was authorized. Victoria's eyes narrowed. The paperwork is completely legitimate, Mr. Foster. I assure you. A wave of grief washed over me, realization hitting harder than the bulldozer itself. Emily's wedding gown, her photographs, the wooden box containing her ashes, all lost forever. My knees buckled, and Officer Hernandez caught me before I hit the pavement. You'll hear from my lawyer, I whispered through clenched teeth. Victoria smiled coldly. HOA bylaws clearly protect us from litigation when acting in community interest. Page 38, paragraph 9. When suddenly, a voice rang out clearly from the growing crowd. It was Maria from across the street, holding her smartphone high. This isn't right. I recorded everything, Victoria. We never authorized any demolition. The board authorized it, Victoria snapped back defensively. Samuel gently guided me away. Daniel, you can stay with me tonight. As we turned, Victoria's voice pierced through me one last time. Oh, Mr. Bennett, don't worry about the roses and mailbox. We've kindly cleared those violations for you. Something snapped inside me. Whirling around, I pointed a trembling finger at her. You never cared about the rules. You wanted my property. For just a split second, her composed mask slipped, revealing pure greed and ambition beneath. That's quite the accusation, she sneered. I hope you have evidence. I do, Maria said, stepping forward confidently, holding up her phone. I've recorded the HOA meetings. Last month you said you wanted all obstacles cleared for Creekview luxury estates. A stunned silence spread among the gathered neighbors. Thomas Caldwell urgently whispered something into his wife's ear. She straightened abruptly, announcing loudly, "This meeting is over. Anyone remaining here risks further violation notices." As neighbors reluctantly dispersed, my phone buzzed again. Michael was calling, undoubtedly wondering why I had left his ceremony so suddenly. "Michael," I choked out, barely holding back tears. "My house, it's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" Michael demanded sharply. "Victoria Caldwell bulldozed it. Everything. Emily's ashes, our photos, gone." Michael's tone shifted immediately, authority resonating in his voice. "Don't say another word to anyone. I'm coming right now." Victoria watched nervously from her porch as I hung up. She had no idea who my brother was or the storm of justice she'd just unleashed upon herself. The next morning, a heavy knock startled me awake. Samuel opened his front door to find Michael standing there, still dressed formally from yesterday's ceremony, authority radiating from him. "Where's my brother?" Michael demanded, his voice firm with urgency. Victoria Caldwell stepped outside at precisely that moment, pausing abruptly when she saw Michael's official car parked at the curb. "Who is that?" she whispered nervously to her husband. Samuel smiled for the first time since the disaster. "Mrs. Caldwell, allow me to introduce Justice Michael Bennett, Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. You just bulldozed his brother's home." Victoria's face went pale as Michael approached, his gaze locked directly onto her. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'd advise you to contact your lawyer immediately." "They demolished what?" Michael's voice roared later that day, slamming his fist against his mahogany desk so hard our family picture toppled over. I'd never seen him this angry. "They destroyed your entire home? Over a mailbox and roses?" "No formal hearings, no legal notices," I confirmed, showing him photos of the devastation. "Just constant threats and petty fines." Michael's secretary entered hesitantly. "Justice Bennett, the governor's on line 1. "Cancel my appointments for the week," Michael instructed sharply. "And immediately get Judge Anderson, the county sheriff, and the district attorney on a conference call." For hours, Michael took charge, mobilizing an unprecedented legal response. Terms flew around: criminal trespass, destruction of property, civil rights violations, emergency injunctions. "You'll stay here tonight," he told me afterward, his voice softening. "The guest room's ready." The following morning, we returned to Brookside Hills. Police vehicles surrounded my former property, yellow tape cordoning off the rubble. Victoria stormed out of her home, angrily confronting the officers. "This is harassment. The HOA acted within its legal authority. Page 38, paragraph 9. The sheriff interrupted firmly, handing her an official summons. "You have an emergency court hearing at 3:30 today regarding the unauthorized demolition." Michael stepped forward then, calmly slipping his judicial robes over his shoulders right there in the street. Victoria visibly faltered as realization hit. "Mrs. Caldwell," Michael announced clearly, authority resonating in his voice. "I've recused myself from your case due to conflict of interest, but rest assured, every judge in this district now knows precisely what happened here." Victoria's mouth opened and closed in stunned silence as neighbors emerged onto their porches, watching in amazement. A news van pulled up, and Victoria shrieked, "Who called the media?" "I did," Maria declared boldly, holding her phone high. "I was too afraid to stop the bulldozer, but I recorded everything. Now everyone will see what you've done." Plainclothes detectives approached Victoria's door with search warrants. She screamed in protest as they began confiscating files and computers. "What happens next?" I whispered, overwhelmed by the rapid shift in events. Michael placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Real justice, Daniel. Victoria Caldwell is finally going to answer for everything she's done. At dawn the next day, frantic knocking jolted me awake. I rushed downstairs, opening Michael's front door to find Maria standing breathless, still dressed in her hospital scrubs from the overnight shift. "Daniel, hurry!" she gasped. "Everyone's gathered outside Victoria's house. You need to see this." When we arrived back at Brookside Hills, I froze in astonishment. More than 30 neighbors formed a determined human chain around Victoria Caldwell's property, carrying signs that read, "HOA tyranny ends now," and "Justice for Daniel." "What's going on?" I asked Samuel, who stood proudly beside the group. "Victoria tried deleting HOA records from the cloud at 4 this morning," Samuel said, waving a thick binder of printed documents. "Luckily, I'd set up alerts weeks ago because I never trusted her. These," he said firmly, holding up the papers, "are copies of everything. Financial transfers, falsified invoices, everything." Maria stepped forward, joining the chain. "We're here to make sure she doesn't destroy any more evidence. My husband called everyone after your brother's visit yesterday." Victoria peered furiously from her living room window, clutching her phone. Seeing me, she angrily yanked the curtains shut. "I should have done this sooner," said Dr. Hayes, standing tall near the driveway. "When my wife was battling cancer, Victoria fined us because our lawn wasn't perfectly mowed." Stories poured out rapidly. Neighbors burdened with unjust assessments, young families harassed over children's toys, seniors terrified of losing their homes. My heart broke, hearing how long everyone had suffered in silence. "Why didn't anyone stop her earlier?" I asked, stunned by the scale of abuse. Samuel sighed, opening his binder. "She started small, Daniel. Little things everyone agreed with. Then she manipulated elections, filled the board with allies, and soon enough, we had no voice." He pointed to financial records. "Look here, $615,000 funneled through Creekview Holdings LLC, directly controlled by Victoria and Thomas. Fake landscaping contracts, overpriced renovations. It's textbook corruption." Suddenly, Thomas Caldwell's sleek black Audi screeched into the driveway. "Get off my property!" he shouted, pushing through the crowd. "I'll sue every last one of you for harassment." Behind him, another calm voice emerged. Michael stepped forward, quietly authoritative. "Do you know who I am, Mr. Caldwell? Perhaps you can explain these emails?" Michael raised his phone. "Correspondence between you and Evergreen Land Corp., discussing clearing Daniel's land the day before his house was destroyed." Thomas paled, realizing he'd lost control completely. Within hours, news vans lined the streets, reporters interviewing neighbors while police officers carried boxes of evidence from Victoria's home. That afternoon, an emergency community meeting was called at the neighborhood center. Samuel addressed the packed room alongside the county registrar. "The original HOA bylaws on file with the county never authorized demolitions," the registrar explained, projecting side-by-side documents. "These clauses were fraudulently added recently." Samuel added gravely, "Furthermore, we've traced HOA funds directly to Victoria's personal accounts. Nothing about these transactions was legitimate." The timid HOA treasurer, Gary Miller, stood trembling. "I signed those transfers," he admitted weakly. "Victoria provided invoices. She told me it was for community security upgrades." "Forged," Samuel corrected, projecting documents on screen. "The actual vendors were never paid. Your money went straight into Victoria's pockets." Murmurs swept the crowd, outrage blending with relief as truth finally surfaced. Judge Anderson's courtroom was filled to capacity later that afternoon. Victoria and Thomas, previously confident, now looked defeated. The judge reviewed Samuel's evidence meticulously, then stated firmly, "The court finds sufficient cause for criminal charges including fraud, conspiracy, and destruction of property. Bail is set at $750,000 each." As officers led Victoria away, She turned angrily toward me, eyes burning with hatred. "This is your fault, Daniel. None of this would have happened if you'd just obeyed the rules." "No, Victoria," I replied evenly, staring back. "It happened because you believed rules only applied to everyone else." As neighbors embraced, tears of relief and hope filled their eyes. Samuel approached quietly, smiling warmly. "We're dissolving the old HOA structure, Daniel. We want your help building something fairer, something better." Looking around at faces once distant, now united, I knew we'd already begun. Robert barely had time to breathe before another storm loomed on the horizon. By the following evening, Brookside Hills was buzzing with cautious optimism. Reporters had left, the police were still reviewing documents, and neighbors finally felt safe enough to step outside without fear of sudden fines or unwarranted threats. But deep down, Robert sensed the battle wasn't over, not with Eleanor still lurking in her house at the end of the street. Late that night, a sharp rap on the front door jolted Robert awake. One of the younger neighbors, Billy, stood there panting, eyes wide. "Mr. Carter," he gasped. "You've got to see this. It's Eleanor. She's back at your property, and she's carrying something." Alarmed, Robert threw on a jacket and hurried down the road. There, illuminated by the pale glow of a flickering street lamp, stood Eleanor. Her expression was colder than ever, face drawn tight with fury. In one hand, she clutched a metal gas can. In the other, a small box of matches. She was alone, her usual allies nowhere to be found. Most had fled once their corruption was exposed. Yet her posture revealed a desperate kind of resolve Robert had never seen before. "Step away, Eleanor," he called, voice shaking but firm. "You're trespassing." She ignored him, kneeling by the scattered remains of what used to be Robert's porch. The foundation was still damp from firefighting foam, used when the bulldozer struck a gas line days earlier. Now, as if drawn to the devastation, Eleanor doused the splintered beams with fresh gasoline, the pungent smell filling the air. Panic clutched Robert's chest as he realized she aimed to destroy any chance of rebuilding. More neighbors rushed over, drawn by Billy's frantic calls. Among them was Maria, still wearing her nurse's scrubs, and Samuel, hobbling along with his cane. Everyone formed a wide circle, unsure whether to approach this woman clearly on the brink. "This place represents everything that's wrong with Brookside Hills," Eleanor hissed. "It should have been leveled ages ago." Robert took a step forward, holding up his hands. "You don't have to do this. Look around. There's nothing left to gain." Eleanor's face twisted in rage. "You ruined my life! All I wanted was a perfect community, and you tore it apart with your accusations and that obnoxious brother of yours." She fumbled with the matchbox, striking one stick after another. Sparks danced in the darkness, threatening to ignite the gasoline-soaked debris. Robert's pulse thundered. He glanced at Maria, who gave him a slight nod, then carefully approached from Eleanor's side. Meanwhile, Samuel crept closer from behind, hoping to distract her. Before Eleanor could drop a lit match, Robert lunged forward and grabbed her wrist. She shrieked, fighting desperately as the match snuffed out between them. Gas can crashing to the ground, gasoline splattered across the rubble. Neighbors rushed in, carefully wrenching the matches from her grip. For a moment, a heavy silence hung in the cool night air. Eleanor sank to her knees, trembling with unspent rage. Robert let out a shaky breath. He looked around at the crowd. Friends, once strangers, who'd come to stand by him. Though the fire had been snuffed out, he knew the final reckoning was still to come. The morning after Eleanor's final, desperate act, the sun rose over Brookside Hills, bathing the rubble of Robert's former home in soft, golden light. Friends and neighbors gathered, some carrying coffee, others bringing spare lumber or shovels, determined to help Robert rebuild. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was an air of genuine hope, rather than fear. James arrived just after dawn, still wearing the stoic composure of a newly sworn Chief Justice. He embraced Robert, then made his way around the gathering, thanking each neighbor for standing firm against the tyrannical HOA. "Justice isn't just about courts and verdicts," he reminded them gently. "It's about doing what's right every day, in every community." The remains of the old HOA board dissolved under the weight of fraud charges and public outrage, leaving Brookside Hills free to form a new committee, one rooted in transparency, compassion, and genuine respect for each resident. Samuel, cane in hand, proudly nominated Maria to chair the fresh start, and the crowd's resounding applause sealed her election. Under the shade of a large oak tree near the stream, they held an impromptu, groundbreaking ceremony. Maria stepped forward, holding a single rose rescued from Robert's damaged garden. "This rose is for all we've lost," she said, voice trembling slightly. "But more importantly, it symbolizes what we can grow together. Beauty, strength, and life in even the harshest conditions." Robert, still shaken by the destruction of his home and the memory of Eleanor's bitter face, felt tears sting his eyes. Yet those tears were mixed with gratitude. As neighbors pledged to help rebuild, he realized the greatest structure they could ever construct wasn't a cottage or a rose garden. It was a community bound by trust. In the days that followed, the old, restrictive rules were torn apart, much like the foundation Eleanor had tried to burn. In their place emerged a fair, straightforward set of guidelines, ensuring that every voice was heard and every concern addressed. And though some scars would remain, the resilience of Brookside Hills shone brighter than ever. If you've ever felt powerless against unfair rules or unjust leadership, remember the neighbors of Brookside Hills. They refused to stay silent, they stood by one another, and they dismantled corruption at its core. Communities aren't just roads and houses, they're people, stories, and shared dreams. Stand up for what's right in your own neighborhood. Rally your neighbors, question authority when it's misused, and support those who can't fight alone. Real change, like a rose in rocky soil, begins with a single seed of determination and grows strongest when nurtured together.